What if I told you that one of the most improbable gatherings of our century took place in Ouagadougou rather than Washington, Paris, or London? In 2025, on a fateful morning, Liberia, Africa's oldest nation and America's oldest friend on the continent, subtly dispatched its foreign minister via the sandy Sahelian highways rather than the Atlantic. The simple presidential office of Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso was the door she knocked on, not the White House or the French Élysée. Consider the symbolic meaning. A nation that chose to seek advice from a landlocked country that was previously written off as unstable and impoverished, whose flag resembles the Stars and Stripes, whose currency is linked to the US dollar, and whose very birth was enmeshed with American influence. This was no ordinary visit. It was a declaration of rapture, suggesting that Africa's political compass may be moving away from long-standing benefactors and toward new, dignified ties. The question is relentless and incisive. Was Liberia's action the first clear indication that Africa's center of gravity has started to shift toward its own sovereignty, or was it a last-ditch attempt to survive? Join me as we go from the Atlantic coast of Monrovia to the center of the Sahel in only a few minutes, revealing how this one trip has the power to alter not just alliances, but also Africa's very future. We must first take a broader view of Liberia in order to appreciate the significance of its decision. Liberia is not your typical African country. Freed African Americans founded it in the 19th century, and Washington's influence was crucial to its very existence from the start. The Stars and Stripes on its flag are mirrored. The United States served as the model for its institutions. Its economy is trapped in a circle of dependency because even its currency, the Liberian dollar, is based on the US dollar. Despite other countries' shift toward independence movements and Pan-African ideals, Liberia was viewed for decades as America's bastion in Africa, remaining steadfast in its support for the West. However, there was a harsher reality hidden beneath that symbolic connection. Liberia's economy is very modest, with a GDP of just over $4 billion. There is growth, but it is shaky and reliant on aid, remittances, and a limited range of exports, including timber, rubber, and iron ore. Although more than 60% of Liberians are under 25, there are still few job openings. Although official unemployment statistics may appear low, they conceal a more sinister reality. Underpaid, underprotected, and with little chance of upward mobility, the great majority of young people make their living in the unorganized sector. Frustration has been growing in Monrovia. While ordinary folks observe the arrival of relief packages and the announcement of foreign partnership promises, everyday life continues to be difficult. Access to electricity is still inconsistent, and many people pay some of the highest prices for some of the world's most unreliable services. But huge irony is made evident by the fact that hospitals are underfunded, schools are overloaded, and roads are still in poor condition. The nation that has the strongest ties to America has not seen the prosperity that many had anticipated from their partnership. This inconsistency could no longer be disregarded by 2025. The young person, restless and more vocal, started to pose more pointed queries. Given that other regions of Africa are starting to forge their own paths, why should Liberia keep searching for rescue elsewhere? When sovereignty is emerging elsewhere, why hold on to dependency? The Sahel, which had long been written off as being too unstable to take the lead, started to exert a new type of impact at this precise moment under Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso transformed from a symbol of resistance into a building site. It joined forces with Mali and Niger to form the Alliance of Sahel States, a group that renegotiated resource contracts, drove out foreign soldiers, and started establishing indigenous capabilities in security, agriculture, and energy. The difference was stark for Liberia. On the one hand, a century-old relationship with the West that had not changed much. On the other hand, a new model that is unquestionably African in its authorship, however flawed and dangerous. Dependency and self-determination were now the options, instead of stability and turmoil. For this reason, the 2025 travel to Ouagadougou by Liberia's foreign minister was not a formal visit. It was an admission, an understanding that the Sahel itself may now serve as the axis of African politics rather than foreign cities. The question then becomes more pressing. Was Liberia's shift toward Burkina Faso an indication of weakness, or did it offer insight into Africa's future course? A future based on domestic bravery rather than borrowed institutions. When we look at what Liberia specifically sought of the Sahel and what the Sahel was prepared to provide, the solution starts to take shape. Burkina Faso startled Liberia by standing tall against all obstacles before Liberia shocked the world by turning to Ouagadougou. Just a few years ago, commentators in Paris and Washington dismissed Burkina Faso as reliant, unstable, and doomed to stay at the bottom of international indexes. However, the country started rewriting that narrative. By 2025, under the leadership of the youthful army president, Ibrahim Traoré, security is the primary factor contributing to Burkina Faso's attraction. Extremist violence tore the Sahel for years. Despite the presence of French troops and military installations throughout the area, her level of insecurity increased. Then the break came. Traoré drove out foreign troops, reclaimed 70% of the land that had been occupied by militants, and established the Patriotic Support Fund, a nationwide system that allowed common people, business people, and even diverse communities to donate over $600 million to support their army and local militias. This was a statement of ownership as much as a security tactic. For Africans watching, it demonstrated that dignity could be funded domestically rather than through foreign borrowing, and that sovereignty in defense was achievable. Resources make up the second pillar of Burkina Faso's allure. Even while its GDP is still low, the reality on the ground is quite different. Part of a Sahelian area rich in uranium and energy potential, Burkina Faso is one of Africa's leading producers of gold. It is home to manganese reserves in Tambao. Together with its allies, Mali and Niger, the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, the alliance controls resources worth trillions of dollars. Burkina's gold, Niger's uranium, and Mali's oil deposits form a basis that, with prudent management, could support both local demands and regional industrialization. The idea of collaborating with such a bloc was not only alluring to Liberia, which has historically relied on the export of raw goods like rubber and iron ore, but it was also necessary for its existence. Energy is the third magnet. New solar fields have emerged from the Sahelian red earth all over Burkina Faso, including Dunsan with 25 megawatts, plus battery storage, Nagriongo with 30, Ha with another 30, Kodaini with 38, and Zaktuli with 33 megawatts. These initiatives may appear small in comparison to those in Europe or Asia, but they have a profound impact on a nation where having access to electricity was once unattainable. They also represent a future in which energy independence is obtained from the African sun itself, rather than imported through expensive fuel exports. Such an example cannot be disregarded in Liberia, where over 70% of homes still lack dependable electricity. However, the most alluring aspect may not be tangible, but rather symbolic. African leaders talked about sovereignty for decades, but few actually practiced it. Traoré's administration invested in vocational training centers for engineers, farmers, and students, renegotiated mining contracts, and diverted state funds away from projects controlled by foreigners. It was disorganized. It was brittle. However, it was genuinely African, and in a continent where young people are desperate for role models, authenticity was more important than well-crafted remarks from overseas. Originally a military agreement, the AES evolved into something more. It started to develop into a political and economic center, demonstrating that Africa could support itself without seeking permission from others. After years of dependency, the message was too strong for Liberia to ignore. This group of landlocked countries demonstrated that poverty is not permanent, boundaries are not fate, and sovereignty is a program rather than a catchphrase. It is understandable why the leaders of Monrovia saw Burkina Faso as a mirror as well as a collaborator. A mirror that reflected a decision that Liberia itself was no longer able to make. Stay bound by the status quo or venture into the unknown of a new African-led future. The discussion swiftly shifted from symbolism to substance, where Liberia's minister sat across the table from Captain Traoré. Given their disparate geographic locations and shared need for dignity, what could these two countries create together? Proposals that astounded both proponents and detractors alike provided the solution. It was not intended to be a courtesy call when they met in Ouagadougou. It was a negotiation of futures in every way. Sarah Nyanti, the foreign minister of Liberia, brought more than just polite pleasantries when she walked through the modest Bashard halls of the presidential residence in Burkina Faso. She brought with her a set of recommendations that, if accepted, might completely alter the cooperative landscape of Africa. The initial suggestion was highly symbolic but also political. Liberia requested support for its application for a rotational seat on the UN Security Council from the Sahelian, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger alliance. This was more than just a diplomatic move for Monrovia. It was a statement that African peers, rather than Washington or Brussels, should now provide validation. The proposal, according to Ouagadougou, was evidence that even the oldest republic in Africa was prepared to cede its legitimacy to Africans rather than to foreign backers. The second proposal addressed access to the sea, which is at the core of Africa's economic problems. Liberia provided the Atlantic ports of Greenville, Buchanan, and Monrovia as entry points to the Sahel. Dependency on foreign-controlled economic routes has cost landlocked countries like Burkina Faso and Niger dearly for decades. Political roadblocks, tariffs, and delays cost their already shaky economy billions of dollars. Liberia was now proposing a collaboration, a Sahel-Atlantic economic corridor that connects the continent's center to global markets for manufactured goods, uranium, gold, and agricultural items. According to analysts, the construction of such a corridor might enable trade flows worth over $15 billion a year. It meant ending isolation for the Sahel. It meant Liberia would have to become the vital link between the ocean and the desert. Security was the subject of the third suggestion. Still recovering from its own civil wars, Monrovia was aware of the price of instability. It suggested holding the AES Liberia Security Summit in Monrovia rather than Ouagadougou or Bamako. The objective: to exchange border control tactics, coordinate intelligence, and lessen the estimated $40 billion in annual damages that Africa incurs as a result of terrorism, conflict, and forced migration. It was nothing short of a paradigm shift for Liberia, which was formerly seen as a symbol of Western alignment, to offer its capital as a center for Sahelian security cooperation. The most audacious suggestion of all was to use African resources to finance independence. Liberia proposed that African countries raise money through regional banks, diasporic bonds, and sovereign wealth vehicles, rather than relying on the IMF or World Bank once more. The message was straightforward but radical. African hands can finance African problems. This was revolutionary for a country that had been dependent on the US dollar for a long time. There were instant reactions throughout Africa. The plans were written off by some observers as symbolic theater. How might such ambitious initiatives be undertaken by countries with weak budgets and inadequate infrastructure? Others, however, recognized the seeds of a new reality in these proposals. After all, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has already been established, is expected to reach a market size of $3.4 trillion by 2030. Homegrown security measures, resource-backed funding, and regional corridors are not utopias. They are essential. Most significantly, these suggestions struck a chord with young people throughout Africa. In April 2025, thousands of young people rallied in Monrovia, waving banners featuring Traoré's face alongside their own Liberian politicians and singing "Africa for Africans." The corridor meant more to them than trade. It was about employment, respect, and the opportunity to stay on the continent instead of jeopardizing their lives on dangerous trips overseas. The choice to join the Sahel was risky for Liberia's authorities. It might offend Washington. It ran the risk of upending established economic agreements. However, it was no longer acceptable to continue the circle of dependency without making any changes. Thus, what was spoken in that chamber resonated over the continent as the sun sank over Ouagadougou. African money must be invested in African hands. It wasn't just a transaction, it was a theory. Despite their audacity, the agreements brought up another issue. Could these weak countries, ravaged by instability and poverty, really fulfill these promises? Or would this moment, like so many others before it, fade into meaningless platitudes? Perhaps the solution would come from the restless young people who had started to see the outline of their own future in this cooperation, rather than from leaders in suits or troops in fatigues. If leaders' words were transmitted by the corridors of diplomacy, then a generation's pulse was carried by the streets of Monrovia. The capital of Liberia burst on April 30th, 2025, not in protest, but rather in a sort of joyful rupture. The humid Atlantic air carried the chants of thousands of young people as they marched with banners that proclaimed "Africa for Africans." The amount of protesters and the name they were chanting were what shocked onlookers. It wasn't the IMF, Paris, or Washington. Ibrahim Traoré was the one. For the first time in recent memory, the young people of the oldest country in Africa turned to the Sahel for answers rather than the Atlantic. Why was this so important? Because Liberian youth had been raised in the shadow of freedom for decades. Deep wounds were caused by civil wars in the 1990s and early 2000s. Nearly 1 million people were displaced, and more than 250,000 people died. Aid organizations established and closed, and foreign peacekeepers arrived and left. But the rates of unemployment and underemployment remained stubbornly high. Young people, who make up over 60% of the population, were left to walk a tightrope between hopelessness and survival. Dignity was not a theory to them. It was the difference between building a new home and leaving the old one. It touched a nerve when Liberia turned to Burkina Faso. The story abruptly changed from waiting for assistance to using what we already had. The ideas for an economic corridor, security cooperation, and development funding for Africa weren't just theoretical. They served as lifelines. Why couldn't Liberia make a future out of scarcity if the Sahel could? Student unions at Monrovia's colleges wrote open letters calling Traoré a ray of hope and dignity. 50 student organizations signed a petition asking the government to strengthen its relationship with AES, stating that African solidarity, not foreign help, was the way of the future. Students in Accra, Lagos, Dakar, and Freetown were connected by trending hashtags on social media such as GERB or Keynote Model and Africa Can Rise, which were not limited to Liberia. Law schools in Ghana started holding seminars where they examined how Burkina Faso had renegotiated mining contracts to retain 70% of the earnings domestically. To lessen reliance on the US dollar, Nigerian economic students discussed the potential for implementing a regional payment system like to that of the Sahel. Youth organizations in Senegal created viral videos claiming that we can rise too. Just like Burkina Faso, the symbolism had a transforming effect on young Africans who had been long excluded from the global discourse. This demonstrated that Silicon Valley support and IMF approval were not necessary for innovation, sovereignty, and dignity. They needed belief, courage, and community. However, there were many who criticized the exuberance. Elders cautioned that young people's enthusiasm may be easily controlled, that catchphrases may surpass the laborious process of establishing organizations. Others contended that Liberia could not afford to irritate Washington, given its precarious economic situation. On the ground, however, the atmosphere was evident. For a generation accustomed to disappointment, the Sahelian Partnership represented more than simply politics. It represented opportunity. The psychological change was arguably the most significant. Young Liberians started to perceive Africa as a place of hope for the first time. They started to envision futures rooted in African soil, connected not by dependency but by cooperation, rather than by dreams of visas, scholarships, or careers overseas. The question then became more pointed. Could this youthful fervor be maintained and transformed into tangible change? Or would it crumble under the strain of internal conflict and external pressure, as so many movements have done before? It appeared that the answer will rely on whether other African countries were prepared to take the same course, in addition to Liberia and Burkina Faso. Every African rising wave has encountered opposition, and Liberia's shift toward the Sahel was no different. The action caused a stir of disquiet in Western capitals. Washington and Paris policy papers swiftly recast the Sahelian alliance as a perilous step toward authoritarianism, rather than as a daring experiment in autonomy. Despite the reality that their legitimacy stemmed from public mobilization rather than foreign sponsorship, media campaigns portrayed Traoré and his supporters as reckless populists. The story was obvious. The decades-old networks of influence would disintegrate if Africa were to resolve its issues without Western supervision. There were hints of more concrete coercion beyond propaganda. For nations that align too closely with the AES, analysts caution that trade terms may be covertly tightened, loans could be withdrawn, or aid packages could be postponed. European think tanks estimated the losses that would result from African countries shifting even $50 billion annually from Western markets to intra-African commerce. The stakes were not just financial and political, but possibly Africa itself posed a bigger threat. History demonstrates that the most common weapon used to undermine African unity is division rather than outside pressure. These unmarked boundaries, created during colonialism, coastal countries against landlocked, Anglophones against Francophones, North against South, remain vulnerable to abuse. Many praised Liberia's approach to Burkina Faso as a way to overcome these gaps, but critics cautioned that if outside parties continued to feed the rivalries with money and media, they might reappear. Not all opinions were in agreement. even inside Liberia, long loyal to American sponsorship, several elites opposed the idea of shifting their focus to a Sahelian bloc that they had previously written off as unstable. They were afraid of economic reprisals, or worse, of being cut off from the financial systems of the West. The difficulty of switching from catchphrases to sustainable governance also loomed large within the AES itself. Rallying people against colonial legacies was one thing. Building accountable, transparent mechanisms that produced everyday gains in employment, education, and health was another. However, one fact that Liberia, America's oldest African ally, was pounding on Ouagadougou's door could not be ignored. In spite of these dangers, no smear campaign could reverse the preconceptions that were broken by one image alone. The question persisted, though, like a storm cloud. Would this delicate experiment be broken by the forces of discord and outside pressure? Or could the solidarity of common Africans, young people, farmers, laborers, and intellectuals withstand the most ancient weapon in history? As history frequently tells us, the answer may lie less in parliamentary speeches and more in the decisions made on a daily basis by those who are determined to keep this awakening alive. We now go back to the picture that started this tale. Once wedded, body and soul, to Washington, Liberia, Africa's oldest country, is now pounding on Ouagadougou's door. The picture challenges centuries of presumptions. It indicates that African capitals, which were formerly written off as incidental, may now serve as the compass for Africa's future instead of boardrooms in other countries. It hints to a long-buried reality. Instead of being a gift that is bestowed, sovereignty is a right that is asserted, sometimes in the face of overwhelming difficulties. There is more to Liberia's decision to look toward the Sahel than just diplomacy. It is a generational decision and a cultural upheaval, where collaboration is more than just a token gesture for Burkina Faso and the AES. It is an opportunity to demonstrate that resistance can be turned into progress, that dignity can be gauged by the opening of highways, the reconstruction of schools, and the creation of jobs rather than by words. However, we must not be gullible. Every act of freedom is met with resistance. Every power will oppose. Elites will be hesitant. We'll test the divisions. Whether they will attempt to halt this awakening is not the true question. They will. The question is whether Africans themselves will continue to believe that those who dare to build will be the ones who will shape tomorrow, and that unity is stronger than divide. This is where each of us faces a difficulty. Will we continue to observe while discussions about Africa's future take place in capital cities abroad? Will we invest, create, and believe in a continent that has all the resources, all the young people, and all the guts it needs to rise? Or will we become participants? Those who accept unity will lead, as Ibrahim Traoré famously said. Those who continue to rely on others will be abandoned. This is the call I'll leave you with. Add your voice if you think that Africa's moment has come, and that Liberia's move toward the Sahel represents a start rather than an outlier. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe for more informative videos like this one.